Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. Dr. John Park is with us. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. Tonight, he will address one of the major questions in the history of political philosophy. What is the best form of government? In Western philosophy, this question has long been thought to be resolved with democracy, to the point of attaining the status of dogma. However, Dr. Park's paper challenges this thesis by presenting arguments for a hybrid view that appends the Eastern philosophical idea of meritocracy, or rule by the merited, to democracy. He demonstrates how his particular hybrid view, meritocratic, I should have practiced, democracy is better than democracy alone. So with that, Dr. Park, take it away.
Okay, and thanks for the introduction. Let me just get up here on the screen a kind of a handout. And what I'm going to be talking about is this kind of major question in political philosophy. So you can think of political philosophy as having two major questions. One of them is kind of like, what would be the ideal laws that a government should put forth? For example, should we have equal civil rights or not? Should we have a welfare state or not? Things like that. But another question is, what is the best form of government? For example, democracy or monarchy, dictatorship, oligarchy. There are various forms of government, and philosophers have debated for thousands of years as far as which form of government is the best. And in the Enlightenment period, the Enlightenment philosophers, they kind of, a lot of philosophers during this Enlightenment era kind of reached this consensus that democracy is the best form of government, to the point where it's kind of dogma, kind of an unchallenged belief. It's kind of just assumed to be true in Western philosophy that democracy is the best form of government. And what I'm going to attempt to do in this presentation is argue for a hybrid view over democracy that appends a meritocracy or rule by the merited from Eastern philosophy to democracy. So contemporary Eastern philosophers, mostly those part of the Confucian school of thought, have been advocating for a meritocracy or rule by the merited. And what I'm going to do is put forth a particular kind of hybrid view fusing elements of democracy with meritocracy and arguing that this actually is the best form of government. Now here, I'm not going to try to argue that my view is perfect. In political philosophy, it's very unlikely that a philosopher can arrive upon a perfect theory as far as what the best form of government is, especially when taking into consideration that there are actors and politicians who are corrupt and can do very nasty things, which can help bring down or help make a particular form of government look very bad. But what I am going to try to argue is that it's comparatively better than democracy. Although my hybrid view is not perfect, compared to democracy, it is better. And so therefore, we should kind of endorse this hybrid view rather than democracy alone. So for example, Winston Churchill once said that democracy is one of the worst forms of government. It's just that it's better than all those other forms of government. And this is, as far as the comparative nature of his comment, this is about right. As far as what the best form of government is, we shouldn't look for anything that's perfect. It's unlikely we can come upon that. But we should look for which view is comparatively better than others, despite having some flaws and weaknesses. Okay, and my view is called meritocratic democracy. It hybridizes kind of these two different theories or schools of thought on what the best form of government is. And to qualify even further, my hybrid view is for I'm claiming that it's better than democracy alone, only for the legislative and executive branches or arms of government. All right, so let's move on to that first section I have here on the handout regarding meritocratic democracy. So meritocracy, it has its roots in the likes of Confucius and Plato. So Plato was ancient Greek philosopher, so we see that meritocracy has its roots also in Western thought, not only in Eastern philosophy. And it stands opposed to the unadulterated rule by the masses that can lead to many poor decisions that should be feared with democracy. So one of Plato's famous and well known for having an objection against democracy. He hated democracy because he said that the masses are largely ignorant, and they'll vote for people who lie and who are corrupt and who really aren't good leaders, but pretend to, who are good speakers and can provoke or somehow get people to believe in them. In other words, demagogues. And he says what's one of the biggest problems with democracy is this issue with demagogues, and the masses are largely not very well educated and not very smart, and they can vote for someone who would be actually really bad for running the state. So instead, he advocated for meritocracy. And so for meritocracy, there are more stringent criteria for being able to run for office in a meritocracy rather than democracy, where such additional standards are to make it more likely that a leader has the intellectual and moral virtues, such as being wise, fair, diligent, and open-minded. So for example, meritocracies can have different kinds of requirements and hoops that candidates need to jump through in order to become an official, a political leader, such as having education requirements or having experience requirements or passing certain kinds of tests. And there are many different versions of a meritocracy in contemporary Confucian thought. To run through just a few of them, for example, on one variant of a meritocracy, most of these meritocracies, by the way, are hybridized in some way with Western democracy. On one version, local officials are all democratically elected just through a normal democratic process. And the idea behind this is that people are more aware and knowledgeable about local government matters because it's closer to home for them. And there's usually less at stake. It's usually in local government, for example, in your city or county, you're not making huge decisions such as to go to war or not. So even if mistakes are made, the consequences at many times are not super dire. But the idea here is with this particular hybrid is that for local government, there will be a pure democracy, but for national government, there's a meritocracy where there's no election at all. But rather you have to, for example, satisfy those certain kinds of requirements I discussed before, such as experience requirements, education, as well as passing certain kinds of tests. And there are other versions of a meritocracy in Confucian philosophy, such as having one legislative house, which could be equivalent to, for example, the House of Representatives, which is just run and people get elected purely from a democratic vote. You have the other house, which could be something like the Senate, where those people get in not through democratic vote, but through a merit-based program. And what makes my view unique compared to other hybrids in contemporary Confucian thought is that national legislative and executive officials all are democratically elected, but they must demonstrate their merit to an examination body in order to be able to run for office. So my particular hybrid view differs from other contemporary Confucian philosophers in that while at the local level it's all run by pure democracy, but at higher levels of government, everyone is democratically elected. So all the usual offices, such as here in the United States, in which you need to run for election to make it, such as in Congress and being the president, you still have to run and be democratically elected. But it's just that in order to run, you have to satisfy certain kinds of merit-based requirements. If you don't satisfy these merit-based requirements, then you're not allowed to put your name on the ballot for a democratic vote. So that's the kind of nature of my hybrid view. In order to put your name on the ballot, you have to pass through certain merit-based hoops and requirements. But then in order to make it into office, you have to be democratically elected. So some of my merit-based standards at these levels are that political candidates must, and here's one of them, take relevant higher education classes such as economics, political science, history, environmental science, and political philosophy with high marks. So you have to have a high GPA. All right, and you have to take classes that are relevant to good political decision making. And as a side note here, my kind of system here does require fully publicly funded higher education, so that children who happen to be born into poor families, they have a shot of becoming politicians as well. So my system does require public schools in college to be fully funded, just as public schools in high school and middle school, et cetera, are fully funded. All right, and also a second merit-based requirement is to pass non-ideological standardized factual tests with high marks, such as tests in the social sciences. So these can be tests on, for example, crime statistics, tests in economics, tests in political science, economics, on environmental science, things like this. And these are non-ideological tests, so they don't test for example, whether you're a conservative. They don't favor like if you're a liberal or a conservative or anything like that. The idea with these tests is that there will be very similar to AP standardized tests that high school students can take in order to get college credit. So these can be difficult tests, and you have to pass these tests with a very high mark. And these kinds of standardized tests are widely accepted across higher education. But the idea with the tests for my meritocratic democracy is that they would be even more difficult and at a higher level. And these possible candidates must also take exams, like kind of critical thinking exams, measuring for how well they can predict events, given a wide variety of information from various different kinds of sources. For example, and how well they can predict whether or not a pandemic, for example, is on the horizon or not. Some other requirements that candidates have to jump through is they have to have experience leading in local government while scoring high on various indices, such as on decreasing or maintaining low crime rates, helping underprivileged groups, and maintaining a healthy economy. So they have to, remember, local government on my system is just run through a pure democracy. So at the local level, they also have to have a few years of experience, prior experience leading in local government. Right? And scoring high on various indices. This shows that people can make good decisions in the real world, as well as provides a good indication that they have strong people skills, strong emotional intelligence in dealing and handling other people, and motivating people to work hard in order to accomplish things that government needs to get accomplished. It's also to have, another requirement is to have a clean criminal record. And there are exceptions. For example, if minor traffic violations, criminal record in regards to civil disobedience, things like this, you can get a pass. Or if you've had criminal history be expunged, for example, a judge agrees to expunge your record because you've had maybe something like 7 years of having not committed any crimes with good behavior, things like this, then you can get your record expunged. And then that's fine as well. You can then run for office at the regional and national level. And the idea behind having these standards is that these standards just kind of in and of themselves, they provide good reason or justification to believe that a candidate is merited and has the moral and intellectual virtues. Now, what's not foolproof, once again, I'm not putting forth a foolproof theory that it's necessarily 100% going to be the case that someone jumps through these hoops and they're going to be a good leader. That might not be the case in all times. The idea here is to provide good reason to believe, a kind of justification to believe that it's very likely that they are merited. And so kind of looking at so you can see my hybrid as having two components, a democratic component and a meritocratic component. Let me discuss more about the democratic component of my hybrid view. So the democracy is implemented since it's too controversial to think we can have a correct hierarchical ranking of the various merit-based criteria such that we can adjudicate which candidate overall scores the highest and is the best candidate. So there are various reasons why I append a democracy as being one component part of my hybrid view. And one of those reasons is that, if you just make decisions based on merit-based criteria, what if you have one candidate who scores higher on tests and one scores higher on GPA for taking those classes relevant to politics? Well, then which one are you going to vote for? Sometimes scores, even though one person scores higher than another, sometimes their scores can be just so close that it's perhaps not enough to believe that the person who scored just barely higher than the other is that much, is smart, is necessarily a better candidate. So that's just kind of the nature of the beast with my merit-based requirements, is that it's inexact. And since it's inexact, in order to kind of address this inexactness of my merit-based criteria, I implement, in part, a democracy in order to be the final arbiter, the final decision-making thing that finally decides which candidate steps into office. So democracy is used to select officials based on an admittedly inexact and imprecise merit-based procedure. Now, merit-based standards also exist on my account once individuals attain a national political office. So once a candidate attains political office, in order to be able to run for re-election, they also have to score well on those various indices, such as having low crime rates, having a strong economy that they did at the local level. And they also have to pass exams to test whether they're up to date on new developments in, for example, international affairs and relations and politics or not. Very similar to how doctors have to continually take tests even after they become a full-fledged doctor in order to make sure they're up to date on the current medical advancements. And regarding education of officials, politicians are required to take college-level classes, as I said, and a lot of these classes are, classes in philosophy, such as ethics, political philosophy, which focus on, how the world ought to be and what government ought to do, but also on, for example, multicultural courses to get people who may not have experience with diverse cultures to gain more knowledge about people that might be coming from diverse backgrounds, as well as service ethics classes. So service ethics classes, you not only learn about ethics, but you also get out in the field and work with communities in need and get practice actually helping people and serving the community, as what politicians should be doing, serving the community and helping those people who need help. One must develop the habit of, on my system, one must develop the habit of acting ethically to really influence action. So this requires things like minority sensitivity education and working in diverse teams at a young age. So you can learn, you can take these college classes and learn about how logic and how to reason well and how to make good decisions in ethics and politics and things like that. But really, in order to be a good person, philosophers like Aristotle and Confucius, they emphasize that people need to form virtues. They need to form firm, stable character traits, such as being honest, wise, intelligent, open-minded. And this comes through education at a very young age and habit. A continual habit of people at a young age being taught as well as practicing and performing good acts. And this, Aristotle and Confucius says, forms the human psychology at a young age that can have an impact, a serious impact when people become adults, such that they exemplify the virtues. They become robust, strong character traits that manifest themselves in a wide variety of circumstances. So taking this lesson into account, which many times is confirmed by modern psychology experiments as well, I require things like, for example, minority sensitivity education at a young age. And this is what I hope to get out of this is just as, for example, there was sex education on teenage pregnancies at a very, in public schools that helped in many states, that helped drastically decrease teenage pregnancies in the United States. The idea here is that this minority sensitivity education can have a like effect in how we treat minorities, such as racial minorities, people of different sexual orientations, or women. And it's also in school, it's important to have children working in diverse teams at a young age. So psychology studies show that when people work in teams and accomplish goals together, such as intellectual goals or athletic goals, then children tend to view people within their team as part of the same team, well, as part of the same group, and they grow, social bonds with with different people within your team, despite having differences in the color of their skin or other like kinds of differences. So have things like that as well. And I leave it up to modern psychology to come up with other experiences and modern findings in childhood psychology as far as what helps shape children in virtuous ways. So let me now get to some of my arguments for my hybrid view. So up to this point, I've kind of just outlined my theory, how my view is a hybrid view, kind of the ins and outs, my merit-based criteria, etc. About my view. I've given some reason to believe in democracy, why I have a democracy appended to my view, namely because my merit-based requirements are not a precise procedure, so I don't want to rely on it exclusively. Other reasons for favoring my democratic component to my hybrid view is that democracy does have notable general benefits found in political science, such as relative peace. Democracies tend not to go to war against other democracies, right? In history, England and France, for example, and Spain constantly fighting each other as far as European history, but we really don't see that much now, given our modern democratic world in the West. Democracies also have a greater level of freedom for its citizens, right? It's not some kind of authoritarian monarchy, right? Severely restricting citizens' freedoms and rights and things like that. Democracies tend to have greater freedom for its citizens, as well as economic prosperity and political stability. And people tend to view democracies as being legitimate, democratically elected officials as being legitimate, having political legitimacy and having legitimate power. It's this interesting phenomenon. Even in East Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea, which moved to a democracy, when they did move to a democracy, people really favored democracy, and they viewed their officials who were democratically elected as being legitimate officials, the legitimate officials, more so than ones that are not democratically elected. And so we have this interesting phenomenon with democracy, is that people tend to view their elected officials as being legitimate, even though those elected officials might be corrupt and poor leaders. They will not, people in democracies tend not to challenge the very system of democracy itself for their country. And this kind of legitimacy provides even more stability and less likelihood for revolution, civil war, things like this. Other virtues have been ascribed to democracy, such as that it has intrinsic value. So intrinsic value means that something has value kind of in and of itself, kind of inherently within itself, it has value. It's just, it allows for consent, right? It allows for consent for rulership because people vote. It allows for autonomy, the ability to kind of make free decisions on your own by voting. Equality, in that everyone gets to vote. Freedom of expression, in that you vote. Freedom of political expression. Also, it's a virtue in that it gives the right to vote. It gives political legitimacy and a greater opportunity for personal growth in learning about politics and ethics in order to be a good voter. Right? With a democracy, it's supposed to be the case that, well, since you're part of the political process and you get to have a say in it, you should learn about politics and ethics and things like this in order to be a good voter. Whereas if it's just a pure meritocracy, or if it's an authoritarian state or a monarchy, you really don't have a say. So there's really not as great of an incentive to learn about politics. So these are some virtues of a democracy, which I do have in my hybrid view. And my hybrid view does respect these kinds of virtues for democracy, and that it pretty much contains as a substantial element Western democracy. Now let me give you some arguments for the meritocratic component of my hybrid view. So one argument is a modern Platonic argument. Plato argued for a meritocracy. He said, just as we should turn to medical doctors for expertise on our health when we fall seriously ill, right? We shouldn't turn to some random average person who's not a doctor on the street for medical advice, it would be best to turn to a medical doctor. Likewise, we should turn to experts as far as making decisions in politics. We should have experts lead us in politics. So I have a more modern Platonic argument in favor of the meritocratic component for my hybrid view. And it runs something like this. When we look at medical doctors today, in order to be a medical doctor, they rightfully have to pass through certain merit-based criteria. They have to take certain classes in college, and they have to have a very high GPA in order to go to medical school. They have to pass standardized tests to get into medical school, like the MCAT exam, and they have to take board exams, right, testing their knowledge in medicine. And they also have to have prior experience, such as being a resident, and having this prior experience is very important for them. Residency is a very important part for doctors. Well, just as medical doctors rightfully have these certain kinds of merit-based requirements they have to jump through in order to become a doctor, then how much the more do we need requirements, merit-based requirements, to be a national political official, in which you have many more lives on your hands, and you have much more complex knowledge you need to know of, such as in economics, political science, history, environmental science, the law, how to make decisions on healthcare, education, etc. How much the more then don't we need to have merit-based requirements for people, national politicians? Another argument I have is, when you look at let's say you own a large corporation in which there needs to be a CEO, right? And let's say it's up to you to decide who's going to be the CEO of your company. Let's say this is a company that you started from scratch, right? Would you give it to someone who lacks any experience in the relevant field? I'm assuming that you would not, right? And experience matters, right? And this is not necessarily only for being a CEO or the business world, but it matters for most or many other occupations, right? Experience counts when you're applying for a job. Prior experience matters, and likewise, we should also put someone in office, in political office at the national level, who has prior experience in local government, right? Doing well in local government as well. And when you really think about it, it's astonishing that there's no relevant education and political experience requirements for the most important jobs in our country, when there are requirements for many, many other jobs, even for the state, such as being a civil servant, CIA operative, a public school teacher, a policeman, fireman, woman, being an attorney for the state, etc. These have requirements in regards to, such as, for example, education requirements. But it's absolutely, at least to me, mind-blowing that for the most important jobs in our country, there are no such requirements, when those requirements are rightfully required for many, many other jobs. Another virtue of the merit-based component, in my view, is that it allows for proper desert. Desert means deserving something, right? In order to deserve something, you must earn it. And on my system, if you jump through the merit-based hoops, that itself provides evidence that you deserve to be in office. You have the knowledge, the good decision-making skills in the real world, the people skills, etc., to make it as a good politician at the national level, and you've deserved it, and earned it. Being popular and receiving the most votes does not show that you deserve to be in office, any more than being popular shows that you deserve to be a medical doctor. Another reason in favor of my meritocratic component of my hybrid is that it's less likely that an unmerited candidate will take office, on my view. Once again, my view is not perfect, and people can, unmerited, bad people, bigoted people can slip through the cracks, even on my system. I'm perfectly willing to admit that. But it's less likely on my view, that an unmerited candidate will take office as compared to a democracy alone. And that's really, the big point as to why I say, therefore, we should have my system, we should implement my system rather than a democracy alone. And another virtue of my view is that it has performance evaluations. So even when people make it in office, they're still being evaluated. And many other jobs have annual, yearly performance evaluations. And if you're not doing a good job, well, then you could get fired, right? Well, on my account, there are like evaluations that you have to pass through in order to run for re-election. All right, now let me anticipate some objections that some might have against my view. One objection might be this. Someone might object against me. They might say, well, officials have advisors, right? And they can rely on their advisors. Their advisors are wise and meritorious. They're merited, and they just need to rely on their advisors. And it doesn't matter if they don't know about international relations or economics or what environmental science, global warming, things like that. That doesn't matter because the advisors will tell them what's up and will advise them in the right direction, and that elected representative then will follow their advisor. So the objection goes. However, I think there's too many loopholes in this system. So, for example, the elected official could put in advisors who are unmerited, right? For example, they could put in, they could practice nepotism and put in people in office who are their family members who lack the merit and credentials to be an official, an advisor at the national level. They could put in yes men or people in the alt-right, for example, who are advising them. And it also could be the case that officials, at the national level, they could have some narcissistic tendencies and kind of be big-headed and think, why should I listen to my advisors? Even though my advisors are telling me this and that, such as in regards to important national matters, I'm not going to listen to them because I know better, I'm the best, etc. So I think there are too many loopholes with this, and that this isn't enough. And I myself, on my view, can also implement advisors just as a democracy can, but insofar as I have the meritocratic element to my hybrid view, my theory is better than a democracy alone. It makes it more likely that officials will be merited. Another objection someone might have against me, they might say this: someone may jump through all the hoops required of a meritocracy to demonstrate merit. However, when in office, all of that may be thrown out the window and the elected official may be bigoted, letting out his or her true colors. So I'm actually going to agree with this objection. This is actually possible on my view, and I'm not going to deny that it's possible. However, the saving grace of my view is that my view is still better than a democracy alone, in that given that my view has these merit-based requirements, it makes it more likely than a democracy alone that we'll have merited officials. Even though some bigoted people, for example, or unmerited people might slip through the cracks, it's more likely, on my view, that we'll have meritorious officials as compared to a democracy alone. Moreover, there are certain things I've implemented in my theory, as I've said before, such as having performance evaluations when in office. Another objection someone might have against me is that, well, my system, someone might say to me, your system is probably not going to be put in place in the West anytime soon. It's very unlikely that this is going to be put in place. And what I want to first say in response to clarify is that my theory here is not a theory about what's going to very soon be put in place or something that's on the horizon, but rather it's a theory about what ought to be the case, right? And what ought to be the case, it may not be put in place anytime soon. But still, even though it's not put in place anytime in the near future, I'm arguing that it still ought to be the case that we should have my system of government put in place, given the many reasons I've provided. So, and one way really to think about my system is that, meritocracy and having merit is not a foreign concept. It's not something that the East only has a monopoly on. Merit is important in the West too for getting a job. Pretty much, you know, many jobs here in the United States and in the Western world, right? People are looking for merit to see if you deserve it and you're going to be good if you get the job. So, and also in Western government, like for example in the United States, the judicial branch is a meritocracy. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to have judges be put in place based on merit. It's judged to have merit by, for example, the Senate and the President. There are already very minimal merit-based requirements to be a congressman or woman or president. For example, having age requirements for experience, for example, in Congress to be a resident of a state or locale in order to more likely have more knowledge about what's going on in that specific location. So these very minimal merit-based requirements are not robust enough for really philosophers to really call that the US as having merit-based requirements in the legislative and executive branches. But this just goes to show that merit is not a foreign concept in the Western world. And what I'm proposing is to not necessarily add in something brand spanking new, but to augment or increase the amount of already pre-existing merit-based requirements in our government, make amendments and increase the requirements and this is justified, so I argue, based on the variety of reasons I've provided. All right, so that's it for what I have, and I'm very interested in hearing questions and comments and concerns.
Hi, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Park? We can go ahead and use the raise. Freedom says she does. Okay, let me unmute Freedom here. Whoops. Okay. Go ahead, Freedom.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I just heard me too. Great talk. That was wonderful. My question is, how would we impose this? Would this be something we would have to change in the Constitution itself? Would we have to amend it? Like, how would we?
Yeah, there would have to be amendments. So, I mean, so, you know, if put in place, that would be my hope, is that we could have amendments to the Constitution in order to put in these kinds of things. But there are other possibilities, possible options that I look on less favorably, such as having revolution. One interesting thing about the political philosophers, you know, they really argued and wrote a lot of papers during the Enlightenment era hundreds of years ago about democracy, when during their time period, monarchy in the Western world was the order of the day. And philosophers, though, kept developing democracy and the ideas about separation of church and state, as well as having a separation of powers and checks and balances. So philosophers developed these ideas for centuries during the Enlightenment. And then eventually people like Thomas Jefferson, for example, read these philosophical works, and people decided to fight for these philosophical ideas. Now, ideally, I would not want to have a revolution that to be instantiated. And I think it's less likely, if my view gets put in place, that a revolution would occur, just given that my hybrid view already contains Western democracy as a significant component to it. It's already there. It's just appending these merit-based requirements. So that's the hope, is to have these amendments if it ever is put in place, and hopefully not have revolution. But I think it's less likely to have require revolution, as democracy did require revolution to get the jump start in the Western world.
Very nice. Does anybody else have any questions? Seth raised his hand. Let me find Seth down here. Go ahead, Seth.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you for your talk.
Hey, no problem.
So my first, I think I kind of have two questions, is
Okay.
do we see examples of your theory throughout or in practice in different countries? And what are those requirements in other countries, and how's it working? And my understanding of Confucius, I live in Vietnam, so I guess I should start with that. And there's a lot of Confucius influence. There's a lot about respect of elders, and it's only because you're old or only because of this you are respected no matter what.
Right, right. That's one of the most important values.
How does that, does that get too overemphasized, or how do we keep that from happening in a thing where we base, well, first of all, the people who create the idea are already old and established, but
right.
where it doesn't become a class system, I guess, maybe, or
okay, that's a really interesting question. In regards to that, let me hark back to the distinction I made at the very beginning of my talk in regards to, in political philosophy, there are questions of, what are the ideal laws that a government should put in place, which could include laws in regards to, for example, respecting your elders and taking care of your parents and things like that in their old age, which is heavily carries, arguably the greatest weight in Confucian philosophy. Versus the other project in political philosophy as far as what the best form of government is, such as a monarchy or a democracy or an oligarchy and things like that. So my talk is only on what the best form of government is. And so it doesn't necessarily implement any Confucian values in regards to the project as far as what are the ideal laws that the government should put in place. So I'm not going to say anything necessarily about that. And there are some, like as you illustrated, there are some serious concerns with those putting that much weight on Confucian values of respecting your elders, because then it could lead to a hierarchical state in which the elders carry kind of unquestionable power over the youth, even when they're wrong, which could lead to a lot of problems. So my talk here doesn't necessarily implement Confucian values in regards to the laws in regards to the rights and those kinds of laws that a government should implement for its people, but rather my talk is only on the structure of government, what the best structure or form of government is.
So
oh, go ahead if you had a follow-up to that.
Oh, no, I don't, sorry.
Oh, okay. And as far as societies that have implemented a meritocracy today, there are some Eastern countries that have implemented it. And these Eastern countries, for the most part, when they've implemented it, such as Singapore and China, the merit-based requirements, they have things like education and testing requirements and prior experience, such as what I've listed. They mostly only have kinds of tests for economics. So they're not tested on other things that might be relevant, such as in regards to the environment, and pollution, as well as in regards to things like civil rights or human rights and things like that. And what we do see in those countries, though, for the economic issues, for what their merit-based systems are actually testing for, namely economics, their economies have been doing very well. For example, China, in history, has the single most largest poverty alleviation record that they've had in the last 30 years since they've implemented this merit-based system, where they've lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. If you keep track of politics, I believe Bernie Sanders made mention of that before, and he got reamed by fellow Democrats and other politicians for even praising China in any kind of way whatsoever. But as a matter of fact, in economics, they have been pulling their millions and millions of people out of poverty at a historical record kind of rate. So this itself provides evidence, empirical evidence that we can observe, political science evidence that, hey, merit-based element can work. And insofar as it works for economics, maybe these Eastern countries should have merit-based requirements for other things like environmental science and civil rights and things like that.
Very interesting, very interesting. Does anybody else have any questions? You can raise your hand or you can pop in the chat and let me know. I'm guessing that's a no. All right.
Okay.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. This will
Thanks for
get
having me.
processed and put up on our YouTube account shortly. So I thank everybody that came tonight on a very busy Thursday night, and we will see you soon. Thanks again, John.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.